Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. We're here to talk about Evergreen and how Evergreen does business. My name is Craig Fulton. I'm an advisor at Evergreen, and what I do is help MSPs ensure they get the most value out of their business when they go through an M&A deal. And I'm joined by...
My name is Sydney Hockett. I'm Vice President of M&A at Evergreen, and I spend my time finding the next best businesses for Evergreen to partner with and be a permanent home for.
And you have done a phenomenal job of acquiring so many great MSPs, but importantly, helping those business owners realize their version of success. And it's been great. So let's just jump right into it. So Sydney, something that I get asked quite often as I'm out in the MSP community is, how does Evergreen do business? It sounds like you guys are doing things different. You're different from the others. Please get into that for us.
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of ways in which Evergreen is markedly different from some of the classic acquirers you see out in the MSP space. And I think there's a lot to be said for every model, but that kind of two main things that differentiate Evergreen, I think are important to understand are one, our forever hold model. So as a holding company, Evergreen's mission and the baseline of everything we do is that we want to be a permanent home for companies. We never sell the businesses that we buy, and we want to be the last transaction that they go through. So not only a permanent home for the companies, but also for all the people, the customers, and everything that comes along with them. Yeah.
Well, something to interrupt, something I think is great about that is it keeps people from making weird short-term decisions, right? If they know that, oh, this company is going to be overhauled and flipped in 3 to 5 years, they might do weird things, right? I always like to talk about houses. Like when someone buys a house to flip it, they end up doing weird upgrades to it just to make it look good and get out the door. But with it being a hold forever model, we want good long-term decisions being made.
That's right. I think the easiest context to put it in is if you think about a more traditional private equity model, which is what most people think of when they hear private equity acquisition. You
Yeah.
have a PE firm that comes in, acquires a business, and ultimately their goal is to sell that business and whatever they're combining it with off for a higher price a couple years down the line. And so their time frame is really anywhere from 2 to 5 years, generally, sometimes a little bit longer, but the very near term future. And so they're making decisions that they can act on immediately. So how do they very quickly drive cost cutting measures, drive revenue and EBITDA growth? And that really changes the approach you take to growth levers you're pulling in a business. For us, we're not operating on a 2, 3, 4 year timeline. We're operating on a forever timeline. And so the decisions you make are in the context of 15, 20 years, not 3 to 5. So we're thinking about how do we set these businesses up for growth in the long term. And because once we own them forever. We're very invested in them being at their core strong, growing, successful companies, not in some ways a tool for us to create a return in just a few years.
And we're going to get into some great details on how we help businesses grow organically inside. So, and I know before I interrupted you, you were about to get into the decentralized operations, because that's one of the questions I get is, well, what does the integration look like?
Yeah, so integration is not a word you're going to hear very often around Evergreen, and I think this totally ties into how we think about that difference and how we're creating growth and driving returns. The way that your traditional PE model works is you combine a lot of businesses together, and what that does is it allows you to cut out redundant teams, redundant people, redundant practices, centralize people on the same tech stack, which can, in the very near term, save you a lot of money. In our opinion, that doesn't set you up for long-term growth. So we operate on a very decentralized model. And what that means is we're very committed to retaining the individual integrity of each business. You're never going to see an Evergreen branded MSP. We believe wholeheartedly in the legacy, the brand, the teams that founders have built, and we want to keep that intact. So the way we've organized at this point, the 65 MSPs that we've partnered with, is we have 3 regional groups, which you can see on the top right of that slide there: Helix, Westwood, and Lyra. each of those groups operates somewhat like a smaller holding company. They cover a region, Helix being the Southeast and lower Midwest, Westwood being the West, and Lyra being the Northeast and upper Midwest. They each consist of a leadership team that houses capabilities ranging from CEO, CFO, recruiting talent, sales and marketing talent. And really those teams, their role is to one, be a support mechanism to the on the ground leaders of each individual MSP, and then also the connective tissue. So we certainly want to capitalize on the benefits of being a larger organization. Evergreen itself is in aggregate the largest MSP in the US. So how do we capitalize again on vendor purchasing power, cross-sell opportunity, best practice, resource sharing, some of those things without kind of infringing on the individual autonomy of each business. So each MSP operates fairly independently day to day within these groups, but have the larger group to lean on from a support, from a growth, from a resource standpoint. And so ultimately we're ideally solving for the best of both worlds, where you get the benefits of joining a larger organization, but not the downsides of, having, in some sense, is your business chopped up into different pieces, your brand change, your customer service change, things like that.
I think this is great. I mean, and a great model for MSPs. I've been working in this industry about 15 years, and I've seen so many MSP owners work so hard to build up their brand and bring their talent up, and that leadership talent has helped them get there. So it just, to me, makes sense that that's all preserved, and I love this. And while before we get off this slide, something you talk about talent model there. When an owner does sell and decides, hey, I'm hanging it up, we got a plan for that. Please get into that for a second.
Absolutely. So we do have a variety across our businesses of what leadership teams look like. Generally, we find that people are looking to sell because they're ready to move on to whatever's next, which could be anywhere from nothing to a new role, or they'd like to keep running their business in some capacity, but would like an added level of support. We've built out a pretty robust recruiting program for bringing in leadership and operational talent to our businesses. And the approach we take to this is, most MSPs are led by very technically oriented people, which makes complete sense as you think about how the business was founded, the skill set needed to build up a business that has technical capabilities. But in reality, often what these companies are missing are the skills to lead a business by a P&L statement, by an income statement, people who really have a business background. And our view is really that if you can pair the technical expertise with the business expertise, that's how you're going to make a business really successful. So we tend to index very highly on backgrounds of individuals who are young and hungry and excited to get their hands dirty, run a business, but also have a bit of the business background to come in and professionalize some of these companies more so than they have been before. And I think one thing I would add is often this takes a role of a CEO or a general manager of a business. It doesn't always have to. We've had instances where sellers are really excited about continuing to focus on the technical side or take on a sales role. Can we bring in someone to take over some of maybe the CEO responsibilities they've had up till now that wasn't ever actually what they wanted to do, and allow them to get back to focusing on what they love doing?
I love that. And look, there's been a lot of people that doubted how that could work, but Evergreen has proved that it does work, as we've placed a lot of CEOs in there. So let's get in a little more of the detail, because this is a question that has come up, and that's, man, I'll stick with the house thing, right? Like, I've sold a house before, I bought a house. This is like very stressful, and I can only imagine when it comes to a business that the complexity goes way up, right? But as you mentioned, having done 65 acquisitions and MSPs and probably a dozen others, and having created hundreds of LOIs and gone through the process, you've nailed it down pretty good. Talk about that.
Definitely. So as you can see, we can operate on a pretty quick timeline here. I would say, our deal processes have been anywhere from 3 months to a couple years. And when I think about the couple years ones, that's purely because we've started a relationship, kept in touch, and it wasn't the right time for the owner to sell. And then we get to the point where it is eventually. Once we say, both parties are interested, there is a fit here, we can move quite quickly. And our goal is really to move as efficiently as possible. We understand that you are running a business at the same time as selling it, which effectively becomes a second full-time job. And so we want to make that as smooth sailing as possible and take as much of the burden off your plate as we can. I think one benefit, as you said, of us having acquired 65 MSPs at that point is that we know the businesses really well. So we're not learning the industry, we're not learning the broad business type as we're going. We know the business, we understand the service lines. What we're really doing is confirmatory diligence. So we've had a couple of calls. We've looked at some basic financials, which you can see in the NDA and data request phase there.
Yeah.
And we've ostensibly come to a point of agreeing on a letter of intent that outlines the terms of the deal. What we're doing through diligence is then validating, we think the business is generating these numbers. Let's prove that that's true. So
Yeah.
the beginning phase of the process can be the most variable in time length, I think, depending on how quickly we come to an agreement on terms, how quickly we get through that very initial data request, which is simply kind of historical financials. And once we sign an LOI, we do a 60-day diligence. So thinking about 2 months, we've done it faster than that as well, just depending on how fast the seller might want to move. And there's really 4 key components to that. The first is a very standard data dump working with Evergreen's team, with myself, the investing team, and the leader of whichever regional group the business will sit under. We'll do a longer form management meeting, really understand some more of the qualitative sides of the business, the objectives, the customers, et cetera. And then we'll move into the quality of earnings. This is probably the meatiest part of the process in terms of work required on the seller's side. Essentially a mini audit, again, to validate the financials that we're looking at. We use a third-party provider who's done all of our deals with us, so likewise understands the MSP business and is going through the motions of validating those financials. Thirdly, we will do customer diligence. I like to call this out because I think this can be a scary piece for a lot of sellers. We are not reaching out to customers. There's no mention of Evergreen or an acquisition. We use a third-party provider that reaches out on behalf of the company to conduct basically a verbal NPS survey to your top customers. And we have you reach out, the seller reach out to let them know that this is coming, as well as vet the questions ahead of time. So we've never in 65 deals had a customer be alerted that there's an acquisition through this piece of the diligence. And then the fourth and final step is legal, getting the purchase agreement in line, hammering out those details with the 2 different counsels. And all of that happens within 60 days.
And then we close.
And then we close.
And I'd like to point out, right? So, I've talked to a lot of people that have sold their businesses in Evergreen, and one that went through a great transition there. He said it was the most exciting and uneventful thing that ever happened to me because there's no integration and decentralization. It's what they want to make it, right? Many employees have said, I didn't even notice it changed. So, that's an exciting time, and we're here at Evergreen to help make it whatever we can. We can show up, we could throw a party, or we could just keep it quiet, however you want to do it. So you got into a lot of detail there, but I just want to talk a little bit more because people say all the time, like, well, what can I do to prepare for this? Like, what should I be thinking? If you could just briefly share your experience in this, it'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I think about it in kind of these 3 buckets, and this looks a little bit different for everyone. I always say everyone has a very similar list of goals and priorities, but they're probably in a different order than the person next to them. And so I think it's important to spend some time thinking about what you are trying to get out of this transaction and this partnership as a seller. What's most important? Do you feel very strongly about keeping your brand intact, keeping your business intact for your employees, for your customers? What are you looking from it financially? I think the more clarity you have around what you need to solve from a personal financial goal, the easier it is to have a candid conversation around how we get there and meet you there. What are you thinking about in terms of your legacy, in terms of your number 2 and number 3 behind you in the business? What do you want to see happen with your team? I think a lot of things can fall into this bucket, but would spend some significant time personally considering what you're trying to get out of this. And the other piece that's included in that is what you want to do on a go forward basis. Is that staying with the business? Is it doing something else within the business? Is it exiting? What does that timeline look like? Then I think there's things to consider around the business itself. One thing I would say is there's always this mentality of, I'm going to prep for a sale. I'm going to stop investing in the business like I normally would. I'm going to stop hiring people I need to hire, and would highly encourage founders and sellers to not do that. We want the business to be set up for success. It's often quite clear when someone's been solving for a sale, and we'd rather see a business that's been set up to succeed for years to come. And so throughout a deal process, we will encourage you to continue making those investments, making those hires. We will take them into account as well. And so that said, I think there's some other operational things that can be very helpful. One thing that we index on that's a little bit more qualitative is the operational maturity of the business. So can you, as a seller, as an owner, go on vacation for 2 weeks and the business keeps running? Does every client report into you, or do they have another point of contact within the business that's there to serve them when you may not be available? Do you have a team? Does every person in the company report to you, or is there a management team that spreads some of that out? So I think there's a lot of different things, some of them listed here under this operation slide, if you want to pause the video and dig in and can talk more about it. But to make sure that the business is set up for success as a business, not just as your business. And then I think thirdly, we'd talk about the financials. One good indicator of operational maturity in a business is what do the books look like? Can you pull data easily, which you will have to do during a deal process? Can we understand the different revenue lines of your business? Have you appropriately broken out your COGS to match the revenue lines? I think that cleanliness and that level of detail is a really strong indicator of a good business. It also makes the deal process infinitely smoother if we aren't digging behind layers and layers of messy financials to try and understand what's really going on. Some other nitpicky things as you think about a deal are just knowing how much compensation you as an owner take. If you're running personal expenses through the business that we would not be considered go forward expenses, being able to identify those. And then one big data piece I like to call out that's a critical part of our diligence is being able to pull monthly revenue by customer by type. The reason we look at this is ultimately we want to understand how your existing customers are growing and continuing to spend year over year. And we want to do that by both recurring revenue and non-recurring revenue. So being able to pull that data, generally it's in ConnectWise or your other PSA, is one I like to call out because that's a big piece of the diligence process.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating here is, these are all great steps, and some people will just start to associate, well, if it's a big company with 100 employees and they're doing great revenue, they probably all got it all together. We're finding it all over the board. So the recommendation I'd give to anybody watching this video is, if you're serious about prep, it might help to join a peer group. There's tons of peer groups out there that focus on this. There's tons of companies that specialize, they work helping business advise them to get to there. So the next big question then for the seller becomes, well, what does the deal look like? And we've got a lot of data on here. Let's not jump into it, but just break down the different things. Is it cash heavy? Do I have to stick around a few years to get a second bite? What does it look like?
Yeah, I'll keep this quick, but some more info on the slide again. But I think there's really generally 4 key components you can see of a deal. The most common, especially in a private equity backed transaction, is going to be cash at close. So exactly what it sounds like, getting that cash at close in your bank account. For Evergreen specifically, we do very cash heavy deals and often 100% cash. So you're seeing that entire purchase price at the time of close.
Nice.
The second most common is some level of earnout. And I think this can be a valuable tool for thinking about how we bridge valuation expectations, recognize near future growth of the business, as well as from an incentive standpoint, if we have a seller that's going to stay on, would like to keep them motivated to continue to grow the business. Typically, an earnout lasts for 1 to 2 years and is tied to generally EBITDA growth, but another growth metric of the business. And that would be outlined very clearly in the LOI of, you get X amount when you hit this goal at year 1 or year 2 post transaction. Thirdly would be seller note. This is a little bit less common, but starting to be more and more common, especially in today's interest rate environment. Effectively, a seller note is a loan from a seller to a buyer to finance the transaction, and it's a relatively risk-free way to continue to get payments down the line. So you earn interest over generally a 5-year period, and then there's a balloon payment at the end on top of the principal. So a little bit more complexity around the logistics there, some more detail on this slide, but can be a way to continue to earn money on a transaction that is not performance driven on the business.
Okay.
And then lastly is retained equity. This is generally a very attractive piece to people. It's very common in private equity deals. For Evergreen specifically, there is an option to roll a portion of your cash proceeds in the transaction into equity in Evergreen and continue to realize upside down the line on the growth of the portfolio as a whole. This is not a required piece. It is an opt-in. It's one we are excited about when people want to continue to be a part of the long-term growth of Evergreen.
I think what's really interesting about retained equity, sometimes when you look at these deals, you could end up getting more the second time than the first time if the performance is phenomenal. So I love it. Full flexibility here. Everything you're saying just shows that, how Evergreen differentiates in the way it does business, the way it structures things, the way it forms its groups, gives its power. I think the best way to really sum this all up is to just show the proof. So let's dive into a case study here. Lloyd Wolf, he was an MSP owner out of Pittsburgh. I met him around the community many times. He was the first acquisition of Evergreen, and it's still Wolf Consulting, and the leadership team is largely still there, still operating, but doing phenomenal. Just touch real quick on, how great this company's done since, I think, 2017, right?
That's right. I believe it was New Year's Eve 2017 that we acquired Wolf Consulting. Lloyd certainly took a bet on Evergreen being the first person to sell to us, and it's been a really exciting success story, and I think outlines the key question that people ask us, which is how do you make businesses better? And so I think this helps show a lot of that. We'll see Wolf started when we acquired it. They were roughly around $1 million of EBITDA, and over the last couple of years have almost tripled in size. And I think there's been 3 key buckets to that are areas where Evergreen very specifically has a value creation playbook for helping these businesses grow. First is around new MRR. This may be obvious, but how do you continue to drive new sales? Building out the infrastructure for a sales team, for bringing in that business and continuing to add new MRR month over month. When we acquired Wolf, Lloyd stayed on for a year, and we brought in Elliot Hyman, who now leads our broader Northeastern group, but as the director of business development, 100% focused on this new MRR piece. Critical part of continuing to build the business. Secondly would be price increases, and this has become talked about a ton recently in peer groups and across the industry. I think it can be a hard thing to do when you've had customers for 15, 20 years that may feel like family, or in some cases even be family, but it's such a critical piece of continuing to build your business, particularly in times when inflation is rising. If you're not going to keep up with that, you'd be surprised how quickly you start losing money on the bottom line if your prices are not keeping up or even exceeding the cost of inflation. So we have great playbook, great support around implementing systematic routine price increases, and doing that not just blanket, but how do we look at projects versus MRR and different pieces of the contract where it matters for different services.
And also being cognizant of where that MSP is and what their customer base looks like. It's not just this standard thing. Everybody has to increase their prices. The beauty of the decentralized model is being, and the power. So
that's right. And doing it customer by customer too. It's not just blanket.
Yeah,
if you've just signed a new customer, we're not going to go in and say prices are raised.
Because I think the last thing we do is acquire a business, do this, and then all the customers are like, you said it was going to be different. And the last thing, cost, right? Controlling costs. What's some common things you see happening there?
Yeah, I think cost containment's a really interesting one, and a lot of things can fall into this bucket. But as you can see, it's been one of the biggest drivers of growth for Wolf and for Evergreen across the board. some of the things that come to mind are offshoring labor. How do you make the cost of servicing every new dollar of MRR cheaper? And one huge way to do that has been offshoring. We have 150 to 200 people in various different locations around the world that are cheaper labor environments. This definitely doesn't work for every customer. It doesn't work for every business, but where it does work, it can be really valuable. There's other more internal things around making sure your team is incentivized to grow the business. Are your engineers incentivized in their comp plans to service new customers to their best of their ability versus someone they've been friends with and servicing for 15 years? That service certainly shouldn't go down. But I think what we found is oftentimes incentive plans are actually not geared toward growing the business, adding new MRR, and continuing to serve that. So again, a lot of things that can fall into this bucket. Another being account management. You've dedicated people who are checking in every year at least with each customer, reviewing the contract, et cetera, and thinking about how we contain the cost of every new dollar of business we're bringing in.
And you covered a lot there. I'll just put this slide up here. We won't speak to it. You covered it. Great job. If you're watching, you're like, what were those things? Pause now. Check it out. So, Sydney, I want to thank you for joining this video today and getting the goodness out there. I know you're doing so many great things for MSPs. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll close with this. If you're wondering, how do I even start? Right? Hopefully you have a financial number in your head that you need to get to one day, or you work with a financial advisor to get there. But why not see where you're at now? We have this great website, mspvaluations.com. You go out there, answer 17 easy questions. They're really not hard. We absolutely need your email address so we can get back to you. And we'll send you that information so you know, where am I at now? Maybe it matches up and we'd love to have a conversation with you. Or maybe you're like, I'm still off a little bit and you've gotten some tips out of this, or we can help coach you, connect you to the right place so that you find your version of success. Thank you for joining today and look forward to seeing you out there and hearing from you all. See ya.
Thanks, Craig.